and welcome back to ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod. Today's episode is our season finale, and we couldn't end the season without a report out on ACRO's 6th year of our annual Risk-Based Quality Management Landscape Survey. My guests today are all returning guests. We have Cris McDavid, Senior Director of Global Clinical Operations at Parexel, Jennifer Stewart, Executive Director of Clinical Data Sciences at Premier Research, and Lauren Garson, Senior Director of Clinical Strategy at Veeva. The RBQM Landscape Survey has been a 6-year-long project for ACRO, conducted with feedback and insights from the FDA, to address how RBQM is being used to design, manage, and monitor clinical trials. We will show some graphs and charts today, so we recommend watching this episode on ACRO's YouTube channel, but we'll do our best to talk through the graphs for those of you in listening mode only. Earlier today, ACRO released a summary report that shows all the highlights and key takeaways from the landscape survey we're discussing in today's episode. You can see all the graphs, charts, and results from the survey on ACRO's website. We will include a link to the report in the show notes. Enjoy! Well, Jen, Cris, Lauren, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have the band back together to talk about RBQM. I'm going to pull up a couple slides as we talk, so anyone who's listening and wants to watch this on YouTube and you want to see the slides, that's where it will be. So for those listeners who haven't heard about our survey project before, can you tell us a little bit about the project and the methodology used to collect the data? Lauren, I think I'll start with you for this one.
So ACRO has conducted the survey over the past 6 years, and all 7 of the ACRO CRO members respond to the survey and on a trial-by-trial basis indicate which RBQM components are being used or not used on individual trials. So in total this year, we collected data on over 4,000 clinical trials that were outsourced by sponsor companies to CROs, and 718 of these were studies newly started in 2024. Which gives us a really good indicator of how adoption is trending and how new studies are adopting RBQM components. There have been a few other industry surveys trying to assess these statistics, all of which have been valuable to this conversation. But as far as we know, ours is the only one that looks at individual trial level. We also believe it is the longest standing analysis, so the trends over time are really insightful. For example, we were able to see the impact of the COVID pandemic on adoption of remote monitoring, and now we can see the beginnings of the impacts of the new ICH R6, R3.
We also collect information about each study, including phase, size of the study based on the number of participants enrolled, and type and size of the sponsor. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see that our data set from 2024 had an even distribution of phase 1 to 3 studies and a smaller portion of phase 4 studies. Sponsors who outsource their studies are more likely to be smaller companies, and the studies are mostly small, though we define small as less than 300 participants, so these are not necessarily tiny studies. Of more than 4,000 studies in the 2024 survey, 38% were in the oncology therapeutic area. Nearly all were conducted for biopharmaceutical companies, and as you can see, only a small percentage were sponsored by medical device companies.
As we go through these results and we start talking about these different elements today, another thing that we ask the audience to keep in mind is that these are projects that have been contracted to be conducted by clinical research organizations. So we are looking across the industry and projects across the industry, but because of that, there are instances where we don't actually have access to the status of all elements implemented in a project. Just for instance, if you think about if we were looking at some of the initial risk assessment activities or ongoing risk management activities, quite often you see 97%, 98%. In fact, we're fairly confident that everyone is actually performing risk assessment and performing ongoing risk management, but those activities may be held in-house with a sponsor. Another example of that, in quite a few cases, may be quality tolerance limits. So just something to keep in mind. Having said that, when you look across the number of projects, the number of organizations, and the elements that we have compiled, we are confident that we are really reflective of overall trends in the industry around the implementation of the different elements of the RBQM and the adoption rate of the different elements. So just something to keep in mind as we proceed.
Awesome. I think that's a great level set for everyone listening in. I want to dig into the results a little bit more. And Jen, I think I'll start with you. What was the most surprising thing that jumped out at you, when you first looked at the results of the landscape survey?
Sure. Since we started this project back in 2019, all of the components have been adopted more over time. So the levels of adoption have increased. We're seeing risk assessments on nearly every study. And for those that aren't included, we believe they're being risk assessed by the sponsor. But over the past 3 years, adoption of many of the components have leveled off or even dropped, where we'd instead have liked to see them more dramatically or even steadily increase. It does show how change takes time, especially in a relatively risk-averse industry. But I would like to call out specifically, while central monitoring, for example, increased from 2023, you can see here on the grid, it went up from 41 to 49% of adoption for the ongoing studies. We didn't see much movement, if any, with reduction in SDR and SDV. And in fact, there was a small decrease in the reduction of SDR. Historically, we saw all three of these components move in the same direction. So it's interesting to see central monitoring increase while reduced SDV and SDV did not follow the same trend.
It is interesting, right? And when you think about quality tolerance limits and KRIs, that's always a question in my mind is, I understand that organizations have a different position or stance especially with regard to quality tolerance limits, but key risk indicators, I would think would be fairly straightforward for project teams to define in the perspective of their protocol, whether those be data quality indicators, if you will, around operational activities or KRIs with relation to patient data. So that's interesting as well, that there's sort of a stagnation, if you will, at the rate of adoption and really looking to see where that's going to go in the rest of this year and into next year as well.
So, Cris, you talked a little bit about that stagnation, and I'm wondering where you see the greatest opportunity for some of these components to be more widely adopted in the years to come.
Yeah. So when we think about the greatest opportunity, or at least I think about the greatest opportunity, I really think about something that Jen was just speaking to around central monitoring and SDV, SDR. But let's just think about centralized monitoring for a moment. If you look at the graph we have in front of us at the moment, we're sitting just below 50%. 50% of the projects do not have centralized monitoring. That's a real missed opportunity. It's a scalable activity. It's not one size fits all. So it really should not matter if you have 300 patients or 30,000 patients. You should really be thinking about how do you leverage those centralized activities. And in doing so, you build the foundation on which you can do things like reduced SDV or zero SDV or reduced SDR or SDR sampling. But if you look at the numbers, we still have 60, 70% of projects that are performing 100% SDV, 100% SDR. So even if you're not ready to move away from 100% SDR, why are you performing 100% SDV? And it may be because you're not performing any centralized monitoring, so you really don't have that foundation, because it's the centralized monitoring where you still have your data oversight, if you will. You're still able to surface insights. If you think about some of the statements put out by the FDA and some of the guidance we have seen as of late, the FDA in particular, as well as the other agencies, are looking for risk-based approaches. They're looking for proportionality. Proportionality is a key element emphasized in E6R3, right? That has come out earlier this year, has in different stages of adoption depending on the agency. So we know that the regulatory agencies are looking for those risk-based approaches, for that proportionality. And so it does beg the question, if you don't have a high-risk patient population and there is not some other element that would put your investigative product in a high-risk category, then maybe look at your trial design. Why is there still this heightened level or higher level of risk intolerance, right? And why are folks not really taking advantage of the centralized activities and the technology that helps facilitate that? You still need a strong process. You still need to have the right people in place, but we do have the technology to help facilitate these things. And then when we think about SDR and SDV, you can think about SDV in a couple different ways, right? Because everybody does have an opinion. The majority of your critical data, in most cases today, and in some cases, maybe it's still 50%, maybe not, is not being collected in EDC. And so if you're performing SDV, in many, many cases, you're not actually verifying critical data because it's not there to verify. It's in your ePros, it's in your eCOA, it's in your lab, it's been your lab parameters all along, right? And we don't always transcribe all this or upload all this into an EDC environment. And if you're of the position of, well, we're going to reduce SDV, but we're going to do it to save money as a cost savings measure, but yet you're still performing 100% SDR, you've negated your own cost savings measure, because SDR is the more time consuming or effort consuming activity, but it's also the high value activity. I'm certainly not saying don't do any SDR, but what I am saying is put in perspective. What is your objective? What is your risk tolerance level? And think about proportionality. And again, just, one more example, because everybody does have a little bit of a different perspective. If you're really anchored to or feel like you need to do 100% SDV or a high level of SDV because you're worried, oh, we're going to miss adverse events, you may. That is a possibility. But the truth is, quite often, there are adverse events that are never reported because the patient never reports them. But if we are performing centralized monitoring, we are able to surface things like, is there a particular site or sites that has a much lower or a much higher rate of AE reporting? We need to investigate that. We need to question that. Is there a particular adverse event that is occurring across your project or across sites that's related to IP or appears to be related to IP? Maybe it's actually occurring around your dosing dates. Those are things that surface in your centralized monitoring activities. So you do get those insights, but you need to put the mechanisms in place to be able to do that. So the biggest opportunity, I think, centralized monitoring, scale it to the fit of your project and the need of your project, and then use that as the foundation for your risk-based monitoring.
I completely agree, and that's where leveraging technology is so important. I know we've spoken about this in prior episodes as well, right? The centralized component of it, the way that Cris just highlighted, that we look at the data differently than what would happen on site or at a single site. Those are totally different approaches. So taking advantage of all of the technology and what we anticipate continuing, to evolve, it will continue to be more effective and cost effective over time if we hone in on how can we best leverage that technology and look at trends and comparisons over time.
I would hope that adding the word risk into a process that you're doing, that people aren't thinking that this is increasing the risk. But if they're just planning, right, doing that risk assessment, and then maybe even doing an ongoing risk assessment, but not changing how they're actually running the clinical trial, then you're really not reducing risk on a trial. Like, things have to change. So reducing SDV doesn't mean just doing less of it. It means focusing it on the pieces that matter most. Doing that centralized monitoring instead of doing those lower value activities like 100% SDV will make the quality of your trial better. Just planning and writing out a document because that document is required and somebody's going to look at it and see how did you actually plan for your trial isn't enough. In order to really improve the quality of your trial, you got to do things differently and operationalize differently. So we hope that coming out with this data and showing how the difference is in terms of all the other ways of doing things like centralized monitoring, like reducing SDV and SDR, and showing that they're not at those levels as much as the levels of actually doing those documentation of how you're going to manage the risk, shows the difference between the two.
So Lauren, I love that, because what you're talking about is quality by design.
Yep.
right? And if we think about this from the very beginning and just looking at what is in front of us in that initial risk assessment, what is the protocol objective? What are those data variables and data processes associated with the endpoints? And then using that information to inform how we create our functional plans, how we control for risk, where we can minimize risk. And then that does allow us to do things in a more intelligent way, not just, we're just going to reduce stuff just for the sake of reducing it, but being able to focus our effort on what truly matters.
And just a quick plug for this ACRO RBQM working group that we have after the survey last year, so of the 2023 data, we also published a paper that gave a case study on pulling a potential trial and how we would take those steps, how we propose approaching a study with a quality by design and risk-based strategy across these components. So worth taking a look at that paper to see a case study on how this could practically be applied.
Yeah, absolutely. We love a plug for an ACRO product, Jen. So thank you for that. So Jen, Cris just talked a lot about centralized monitoring, and I'm wondering if you could stick with that theme for a little bit and talk a bit about the cost benefit considerations around centralized monitoring. Is it better suited for larger studies maybe? When do you start to see the cost savings come into effect?
Sure. So first, as was shown a little bit earlier, our survey data showed that of the 4,000 or so, more than half fell into the category of small study. So keep that in mind here when we're talking about what's better suited for larger studies versus the data that we've reported on. It just so happens that the partner CROs weighing in this year have more small studies going on than others. And again, that's 300 participants or less per study. Many pharma companies that outsource their studies to CROs are the smaller companies, so they do skew the results downward somewhat. We did do some additional digging, though, narrowed it down to new studies started in 2024 with large or mega in size, which is 1,000 participants or more. And the good news for those studies is that the adoption of central monitoring there was over 70%. It was 71%, in fact. So we're seeing, more than 2/3, almost 3/4 of new studies that fall into that larger size, according to our definitions, adopting centralized monitoring, which is absolutely appropriate and good to see, especially when, Cris mentioned earlier when we were looking at the data where it's less than half overall of the ongoing studies that had centralized monitoring. It does reflect that what we would expect, that larger studies are likely going to have that. On the contrary, to Chris's point earlier, this concept of proportionality and what's appropriate for a study varies based on its size, based on its population, and therefore we still think there's space for centralized monitoring to be adopted on studies that aren't large or mega in size. With respect to cost, there's a misconception there, right? Sometimes if we're adding technology on top of process, I think both Cris and Lauren mentioned this earlier, if we're doing 100% SDR and SDV, and we're adding central monitoring, and we're investing in technology, early on that is going to require an investment, and it may take some time for a company to fully embrace a risk-based approach, to fully implement that and understand what the right balance of those activities is. So not just being additive, but being complementary and maximizing the use of each component in a way that makes sense for a given study or for a given company, right? The level of risk aversity is always going to come into play there as well. But with a combination of central monitoring and reduction in SDR and SDV, there can be a cost savings of anywhere from 5 to 25%, depending on the details of that study, the size, the visit schedule, and so on. Another thing here when it comes to cost is that centralized monitoring is local, it's in-house. It doesn't require travel, it doesn't require all of the things that come along with that, the time on the road, the associated costs, especially in an environment now where costs for the same things a year or two ago are much higher. And so it gives the opportunity to, influence the cost there, to reduce the cost potentially by focusing more attention on that centralized monitoring component in-house. It also gives the CRAs or the people in the field the opportunity to focus on what's most important for that role. And so we can optimize the time that is spent on site, that is spent in the field, on other components that ensure quality, and allow the data reviews and the analytics and the insights to be coming from those centralized monitors. They can kind of guide the CRA as to what to dig into further on the site as well. Beyond the cost, there's a quality component of this, right? Even more importantly than the cost. So Cris gave a few examples of the trends that could be identified via central monitoring that are really difficult for a CRA to catch, like a trend in AE frequency across sites. So maybe there's a site that's underreporting or overreporting, and doing that review centrally would call that out much easier than a single CRA at a single site. There's another component of the potential cost, even though it's difficult to quantify, of a quality event occurring versus the investment upfront to prevent that quality event from ever occurring. And maybe one day we'll be able to quantify that. I know we've talked about this in the past. In fact, even in a roundtable discussion, there were peers across the industry who were really interested to see, could we get input from the agency or from regulatory group on what worked and what didn't, or where there was a fail, what was the fail, and then could we try to quantify it? So far to date, right, it's a little bit difficult to say how much a quality event cost and prove that implementation of a risk-based approach with central monitoring would have prevented that cost from being spent. But still, it's an important concept nonetheless, because we're looking at the data in such a different way than we have in the past. And then just along the lines of the regulators' input in general, they have expressed the desire that products come to the market in less time and at a lower cost. And we've heard from the agency that technology changes haven't yet translated into a reduction in the cost of clinical development. And the evolution of ICH E6 now with R3 is showing the support for innovation. And so I think overall the goal should be catch the things sooner, shorten the overall timelines, and ultimately we'll be able to get to faster results and have confidence in those results.
So I'm going to jump in for a minute, Jen, because you mentioned several things there that really sparked further thought on my part. One with regard to the size of the projects, right? And a lot of times when we talk about size of study or size of project, we reference patient size because that makes complete sense. But we should also think about data volume and the type of data, because there's a lot of data. If you think about e-diaries, or you think about a project that possibly uses multiple ECOAs or ePros, or not necessarily ePros, but assessments, there's this interrelationship of data, and it is very, very hard to pick up on relationships looking at manual listings, if you will. Even if the listing is on a screen in front of you, right? Not an actual piece of paper. So maybe you don't have 300 patients, but you have a large data volume or a complex type of data or set of data. This is where you come in with the strength of scalability and the tools you choose for the job, right? Make sure what we're doing is fit for purpose. The whole thought behind what is the monitor doing at the site? We want to see our monitors really there to support those sites with those patient care conversations, recruitment, retention conversations, that sort of thing, not necessarily head down doing line item data reviews. That should be done before they ever get to site. And then if there are open items or open issues, the CRA or the monitor, of course, can address that directly with the site staff, right? So the cost is not always immediate up front, but over time, it is actually baked into your delivery. The cost of a quality event. Well, one reason why we have such a hard time quantifying that is who wants to go public with what they screwed up? Nobody wants to go public with what they screwed up, right? And so it is hard, but we're all interested. Jen and I were in the same room. A group of industry professionals all said, we want to know what that looks like. But I do think there are other ways that this shows itself where you don't have to extend enrollment and add X number of countries or X number of sites, because you figured out early on where your weak spot was, or your site or sites that needed a little extra attention. So I do think that there are things that, while we may not be, saving X dollars on day one, we do know from experience, at least most of us that have been in the industry for a few years, of what it costs if you have to firefight on the back end. I'm not sure who would go public with a great example of that, but we've all lived it. Maybe we just need to figure out how to talk about it in a different way. Maybe that's our next conversation. So
I just wanted to add there that the area that really strikes me is quantifying quality, and how it's really hard to quantify a cost of the quality of your trial. But we do know that focusing on higher value activities and higher risk areas will overall make the quality of your trial better. So whether it makes it go faster, which we also know will reduce the cost, making the quality better makes you have to work on resolving issues less. And the cost of resolving those issues is high, whether it's a delay in getting an approval or a response to a finding. If the regulators are telling us to work in a certain way because they know that it will be better for the overall outcome of your trial, it will automatically just make things less expensive. Even if you have to invest in new technology or change your process, those things are not there to make things more expensive. Those things are there to make the quality better and therefore to make it less expensive.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here. I feel like we could talk about this forever. But I wanted to end off with perhaps the hottest topic of recent times, and that is AI. I really feel like we can't have a conversation about literally anything these days without talking about AI. So I'd love to hear from each of you. And Lauren, maybe I'll have you start on this one. What do you see as AI's role here? Are companies using AI to advance their centralized monitoring strategies yet? Should they be if they're not already? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so AI is definitely a buzzword, not just in this industry, but I think we hear about it constantly. And it definitely has a role in the current and the future state of RBQM, and I think specifically around centralized monitoring. So we are doing centralized monitoring today, and the next step might be doing centralized monitoring by AI, but overseen by humans. And then the step after that could be agentic AI, which is a type of AI that autonomously makes decisions and then acts on those decisions and adapts its behavior based upon its response to the environment, all with minimal human intervention. So that AI technology is going to continually get better and better and better exponentially. But to get to that future state, we need to increase the centralized monitoring that we're doing today so that the AI models can learn how to do it. So the data that we're collecting now will one day be a part of how those AI models are trained. And the only way to gather those data sets is to start with centralized monitoring the way we do it today. It isn't the end goal, it's just step one. And we also believe that the fears that AI are going to actually replace actual people doing the job, actual CRAs, actual monitors, that's not true. It's just going to better equip them to more effectively root out those errors and build those better relationships with their sites and focus on those high value activities. But also, due to advances in AI, SDV may be a thing of the past. So, it's only a matter of time and only a matter of how good the technology can be. And as Cris mentioned earlier, data sources are increasing significantly. So the technology that we're doing for the collection of data like ePro and eCOA, we're not doing SDV on those. So we really need to change the way we approach data review to keep up with that influx of data sources that are available even today. And then finally, and I'll turn it over to Cris and Jennifer, the FDA is fully embracing AI, especially this year. They've already made many announcements about it, how they're using it. So the industry has an opportunity to follow suit, of course, with the appropriate controls and human oversight. It's an opportunity to advance and innovate in a way that will help patients and bring medicines to the market faster and more cost effectively.
Yeah, I think, Lauren, you summed up a lot of what I had in mind here too, and Cris mentioned this earlier. First of all, AI isn't going to replace people, at least not anytime soon, hopefully. Not ever, but the insights that are coming out of it can allow, for example, a CRA who's visiting a site to hone in on what specifically needs the attention and help adjust what the site is doing or what's happening even directly from the participant. And so not only are we training these AI models to make decisions or to, to learn over time, there still is this component, this human factor that we continue to need to learn over time as well, right? There needs to be a feedback loop. There needs to be some subjectivity and not everything being treated equal, if you will, to balance or support the use of AI, especially when we get downstream to the agentic AI and so on, right? In my opinion, there will need to be learning on both sides, the machine learning, the technology, but also what are the people involved doing and what kind of adjustments need to be made there.
There's not a whole lot that I can add to what Lauren and Jennifer have shared with regard to AI. I will double down a little bit on a couple of the statements and add my perspective in that the data tells a story. The patient data tells a story, and then as a collective, it tells the project story, right? Our technologies today, those where we're leveraging AI, where we will leverage AI in the future, that helps facilitate findings, right? It helps surface anomalies and trends. It helps us concentrate our effort and our time, but it's still the person telling the story. You need to be data literate, if you will, and you need to be able to message to your audience, whomever that audience may be, what is happening in the data, what the technology is helping us see in the data, and why it matters, why we care, right? And that's not going to 100% shift from an individual to a technology. The technology is there to help facilitate, and the technology will continue to grow stronger, especially as Lauren and Jennifer have just pointed out, we train it correctly. That also means that we train bias and hallucination out of it. And so these are things that we need to keep in mind as we are choosing technologies, as we are thinking about our current staff, our resources as people, right? Their skill sets and what our industry needs to be successful. When you think about traditional models or role models, if you will, and you think about data managers and looking ahead, we should be thinking about data scientists. And when we think about monitors, we should be thinking about site relationship liaisons. Maybe that's not what you call them, but that is where they're really there to help support that site and basically drive the success of trial delivery, right? The ultimate goal is to bring the product to market. And, that product is meant for the betterment of a patient population. It comes back to the data. And so if the technology in place, including AI, including large language models, agentic AI, is able to really dig into that data and help us get to insights earlier and make decisions more quickly, make quality decisions more quickly, then we will get product to market on a shorter timeline and bring those treatments to patients. And that's the goal. So I look forward to it. A couple of years back, I was kind of like, oh, well, I don't know about all this. What are we doing now, right? But it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion of get on board. Let's figure out how this works today and how it will work in the future and how we learn to use it to do a better job at our job and for the industry.
Yeah, Cris, and I'll just add there that, coming from a technology company, when we talk to different sponsors and CROs and we're talking to them about the use of AI, some of them want to jump full steam ahead and, say, give me everything you got. Other ones are more risk averse. I think that there should be a happy medium, right? Let those who really want to go crazy on it, maybe do it in a less regulated industry first and see how that works. And then, try to use it to betterment of the important industry that we work in, right? Getting those good products and getting the health to patients sooner. So don't not use any AI, but I think that there's a good way of using it in moderation to see, you know, how is it really going to better the industry?
So Lauren, you brought us back to proportionality. I love it.
There we go.
Great.
Yeah, I think some very, very exciting times ahead. And, you know, we've already got our next season topic picked out, so we'll just have you guys back and we'll keep the conversation going. But I just wanted to thank you all so much for joining me today. I think this has been a really great episode, and I hope our listeners enjoyed it. So thank you all so much. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the season finale of GCP. And thanks for listening along to season 3. We'll see you back here for season 4 very soon.